I can tell you another story because, in our bilateral discussions with all these countries, it was much more interesting, much more exciting. But most of them even explicitly said that, well, we can't talk about this publicly, But there were some exceptions.
Okay, we are here. This is the Inevitable and Obvious podcast, and I'm here with Janos Pasztor. Janos, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate this.
Thank you for having me on your program.
Absolutely. I'm very excited to have you here. We've had a few discussions previously to this and had a lot of email exchanges, and I've found you to be just a wealth of knowledge and experience and wisdom. And my hope here is that in this show, and I'll explain who you are in a second, but in this show that we're talking about governance and climate policy with respect to SRM, sunlight reflection, and I think this word governance is pretty abstract. And I think a lot of people might have questions about what it actually means. I mean, I've been reading and talking to people and thinking about this for only a year, and there are many people who have much more experience, and I feel like I'm only now starting to kind of wrap my head around what it actually means. So to start, so you are a very experienced diplomat and policy expert. You were previously the executive director of the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, which was known as C2G. And before that, you an assistant secretary general on climate change. And I know that you are, I think you describe yourself as retired, but still quite active in the space. And so tell us what was C2G and more about your background and about governance, and then we'll get into it.
All right. Well, thank you again for having me, and I look forward to sharing some interesting ideas with you. So first, going back to C2G, that was a small initiative that we set up, and it happened after my second retirement, and then there is a third one later. But the idea was that by 2016, there were lots of academic work on governance of at that time, it was called geoengineering, and whether it's carbon removal or solar radiation modification. And it was felt that it needed to go to the next stage to try to bring these issues to the policy people, to governments in particular, so that they reflect on not just the risks and benefits of these new techniques, but also the governance challenges, and then deal with them. So that was the idea of the initiative. We didn't create an institution with a legal personality. It was always meant to do a few years and then close down. That was the plan. And it was very important for us to ensure that all this work was done in an impartial manner. Now, impartial doesn't mean that we were neutral about climate change issues. We were, of course, not neutral, and we accept all of the intergovernmental outcomes like the climate process and so on, sustainable development, but we were impartial about the use or not of these technologies. And that was, excuse me, that was really important for our work, and that helped us to open many doors that otherwise would not have opened had we been more partial toward being against or being for the use of these techniques. So that was the essence of C2G, and maybe some examples will come up in our discussion, but we actually achieved quite a lot of interesting things during the 7 years that we were in existence, and then we closed it down at the end of 2023, pretty much according to plans, because we felt that more of the same activity would not be helpful, and we didn't want to do mission creep, so we said, that's it. We close down, and then other things will come up. Now, one really important, if I may just add it to this, is the word governance, because it was in our title and it was really the focus of our work. And the way we approach the governance, as many others also do, is that it is not simply governments taking regulatory action. It includes that, but governance is something much broader, including whole of society, different groups in society, academics, NGOs, private sector, and all of them working towards some kind of social license toward or against some new activity. And then it becomes something much more exciting because lots and lots of different actors in society have a role to play in the governance of this new technique.
Yeah, that's something that I've been thinking about where when trying to understand what does governance mean. And I take your point that it's not just governments taking action. And a common thing that people say about SRM and how to do, if we were to do SAI at a global level, and the question comes up, how do you even make a decision to do that? Who makes that decision, and that kind of thing. And there's discussion around, well, okay, that means we almost need to invent like a whole new politics for this, and we need to think about like which institutions are making decisions and where. And it, in some ways, I hear people presenting it in almost like a self-defeatist way. It's like, well, this is so complicated. This is so challenging. We don't know where to start or how to do this. And so that alone is a reason that we just shouldn't even be considering this or researching it. And I find that fairly cynical, and that also just doesn't make sense to me from like an historical perspective. Like there are many, many, many globally impactful decisions that have been made in ways that were messy and complicated and involved lots of different institutions and governments and whole of society, as you say. So I sort of wonder what you think about that. Do you agree with that kind of perspective?
So I'm sure it will be pretty complicated and challenging to build up the governance frameworks that are needed for these kinds of techniques, but I don't think it's impossible. There's nothing inherently impossible about what needs to be done here. I think as a first step, I think it's really important to sort of break down a little bit what we mean by governance for SRM. What are the main blocks of governance that one needs? And then it suddenly becomes much more easy. So from my standpoint, the number one relates to research, because research is going on in different parts of the world, but it needs both guardrails around the research so the public feels safe that everything is okay physically and otherwise. But at the same time, I am one of those who believe that we need more information, which means we need more research. And then you need to also make it possible for more research to happen, i.e. more resources, et cetera, et cetera. So the number one for me is research governance. And later, maybe we can go into some of the more details. But then next to that is, and this is crucial, getting ready for a governance event which can eventually decide whether or not one is going to make use of this technology. Now, given the kind of the global nature, it has to be some kind of multilateral process involving countries, all the countries. And the question is, what are the building blocks that are needed to get us there? And clearly, the first one is more information out of the research that we just talked about. The second, and this is where the broad society-wide governance becomes important. We need conversations about this. We need conversations by different actors in society, across borders as well, geographies, and across economic and wealth levels and so on. We need those conversations, not just between individuals and groupings in society, but also between countries, informal and later formal conversations that can then figure out how and where and in what institution we might get to the decision-making part. And we also, what kind of information is needed, what level of detail in order to be able to make the decision on whether or not to deploy. And very importantly, once that decision is made, what kind of governance structure is needed if it's a yes, And what are we going to do if it's a no? Because it is not inevitable that we will have to use stratospheric aerosol injection or other solar radiation modification methods. At least for now, it's not inevitable, but we need to be ready for that. So I think if we break down the different elements like this, then it's a little bit less complicated. It will still be challenging. I have no doubt about that. But it's not, sometimes it's not like we have an option that, okay, let's do it or let's not do it. We have to do it. Why? Because things are happening. Out there, things are happening. And just look at the climate. The climate is not exactly going in the right direction these days. So we just have to figure this out, how to do it, and then we will get there.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Some people would say, it's already too hot. There are some really, really negative consequences that are harming people right now around the world. And every month of delay is a month of more harm. And so what's like the emergency is here and now. And so what's wrong with sort of maybe a unilateral action? What's the downside of, like, there aren't that many countries that are capable of this. Let's say it's just the US. What's wrong with the US just deciding to take action on this? Even if, and let's assume that they, do it in a way that is, the more like idealized path of deployment and that kind of thing. But what's wrong from the governance side of things?
So before getting to the unilateral action, let's just address one point, that at this point in time, we do not have sufficiently good and detailed information about the risks of doing versus the risk of not doing. We have a good sense. There are lots of papers around, lots of good analysis, but overall, I don't think we have enough to make a definitive statement that it's so bad that we must do SRM tomorrow or next month or next year or next decade. But we need to get there at some point. So I think that part is really important, and it has to involve more than just researchers and politicians. It has to involve society as a whole to understand what this is and what this would mean. Now, jumping to the unilateral action. So this is complicated because whatever you do, especially, let's just look at stratospheric aerosol injection for now. There are other SRMs, sure, but this one. It is clearly a global technology. Whoever does it, it will have global impacts. And we know that the impacts will not be completely equal. There will be some people better off, some people worse off. We have some information and data about that. But again, we need more. Now, if a country were to decide unilaterally to go ahead and do this, there are other countries who have not decided that they want to do it. And then how do you deal with that? Then more importantly, even if other countries would come along eventually or not oppose it, but think of a situation where you start doing unilateral deployment and you're cooling the planet, and suddenly something really weird happens to the monsoons in Asia or whatever else. And then immediately there will be the accusation that that's because of the stratospheric aerosol injection. And imagine if you had a situation where every country has gone into this and said, okay, we accept these risks, it will still be a problem, but at least there is some kind of common ownership. But if it's unilateral, there isn't. And even if it's scientifically not shown that, in fact, it is because of that stratospheric aerosol injection, the perception that it is that is just as important. So you have all these problems. And then it could go even worse in the sense that the US or another country starts unilaterally, and then some other country says, no, I don't want this. I'm going to do counter geoengineering, as it's called. And they put the chemicals in the stratosphere that do the opposite. Is this the kind of world we want to live in? So the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has clearly identified this in the sixth assessment report, that unilateral action is literally ungoverned action. It is risky, and the risks of that are important enough to engage in a governance conversation to make sure that we don't end up with unilateral deployment.
Yeah, I think it's I think of it like the we don't know. I mean, this is just from a like atmospheric science perspective, like relatively complicated, and there are these risks, and we would want to mitigate these risks as much as possible. And I think you're bringing up a really important part about the human element of this. Like even as you were saying that, I was thinking about this unilateral U.S. war in Iran right now, where President Trump made no case whatsoever to the American public or anyone else. And so now we have found ourselves caught in this situation where, they did not do so in a way that brought allies along. And so now there are consequences that are coming to bear fruit on this. And where this goes from here is so unknown. And, I could imagine a similar sort of scenario happening with a unilateral SAI deployment where, it creates massive uncertainty. It roils economic markets. It makes it impossible to know what we might do in the future. It creates the conditions under which you can get even more war and disagreement and breakdown of civil society. And so I think these are really significant risks, and we have a perfect example of this right now, and we've seen this many times before. And so when I see these discussions, what I'm hearing from people is a sense of like, we can see how this could go really poorly, and it's only because the climate situation has gotten so bad that we're even considering this in the first place. But if we are going to do that, then we really, really need to get our ducks in a row and make sure that we have as many contingencies as possible to avoid these greater things.
Maybe if I could just add to this. So when we say, well, when I said unilateral action, there's many different ways of doing unilateral action, because one could have a country say publicly in the UN or just simply out on the news or whatever that we want to do this because we're convinced that we need it, and then try to build a coalition, again, ideally in the UN, because I think it is an ideally this is a multilateral problem to be addressed in a multilateral institution. But still, there are different ways of building the coalition and engaging the different actors before you actually start sending up the planes and start spraying sulfur or something else into the stratosphere. So I think that what the IPCC stated and what I referred to earlier is the actual unilateral deployment, starting to do it. But before you get there, there are many, many things one can do, even if a country has the initiative to push this forward.
Let's go to your experience with C2G, and I'm really curious about the conversations that you were having. Like, you were meeting with different leaders and diplomats and NGOs and policymakers and so on, trying to talk to them about this. And it's a different time there than it was necessarily even 5 years ago. But what were those conversations like? What would you say, and what would people say in response?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was interesting when we began in 2016, 2017, and we were working at that time both on carbon removal and on solar radiation modification. Mm-hmm. Later, we focused only on the latter. So when we raised the solar radiation modification issue in the beginning, I must say that very often the reaction was, "What planet are you coming from?" It was really at that level. But there was always curiosity to listen and to try to understand the issues. I don't recall ever having a sort of a hostile reaction, or something. There were a few countries where they just simply didn't want to meet us. That did happen. Not a lot, but there were a few.
What
In
is
most,
there a reason why?
well, we don't really know that, but I mean, I for example, in the UK, they had a very clear white paper written that SRM is not part of their toolbox, and therefore, what's the point of discussing it? Now, things have changed in the UK since that
Very much.
time in a certain way, but maybe there were a few other countries like that, but most countries responded positively. And it was interesting that in the early meetings, because we prepared a lot of policy briefs and evidence briefs by C2G to try to produce impartial information. And in the beginning, they were using our briefings. And then 2-3 years later, you meet the same people and they have their own briefing notes, So things have changed, even during the time of our existence. And I would say between the time we started, which is 2016, and now, there has been a really substantial change in understanding. And one is beginning to get to the point where actually it's possible to have normal conversations about this issue. Not everywhere. I don't want to overstate it, but compared to what we had, I think it's the situation that was always very polarized. Now it's less polarized than it used to be. And you don't get immediately shut down if you raise the word SRM or something.
Mm-hmm. Were there any different patterns by region? And I don't know, can you give us any examples of like what these conversations kind of sounded like?
Well, just two examples quickly. I'm sorry about this, but we had in the case of Germany, for example, the officials we met didn't really. They were interested, but they say, no, we don't need to talk about carbon removal and definitely not solar radiation modification because we're going to just reduce our emissions. And then comes Chancellor Merkel, who says we're going to do net zero. And suddenly Germany is doing carbon removal. Things can change very quickly. The problem was that there had been no very little public discussion of carbon removal when the decision was made. Okay, now we have to do carbon removal. So they had to catch up on that. Is it going to be the same on solar radiation modification? Well, we'll find out eventually. I don't know. But I mentioned the case of the UK, and it was interesting because it was one of the developed countries that never actually wanted to meet us at the senior level. And then you now have a public funding institution that is providing substantial resources for research in relation to solar radiation modification. So things have obviously changed since that time. So these things happen, and it's. I can tell you another story because in our bilateral discussions with all these countries, it was much more interesting, much more exciting. But most of them even explicitly said that, well, we can't talk about this publicly, But there were some exceptions, and one of them was Belgium. In 2019, they were preparing for being the president of the Security Council in 2020. And they wanted to do something substantial on solar radiation modification. So they contacted us, and we had a very interesting relationship. And we suggested that it's probably not a good idea to take it into the Security Council for some kind of conclusion decision because it's just going to blow up. But rather, the Security Council has many informal ways of dealing with these issues, like the Ariel framework, where it's basically an open discussion that is different than a formal decision-making meeting of the Security Council. So we agreed with them that they will host an event in the UN General Assembly an informative event where we bring in experts on risks, benefits, governance challenges, north, south. We had the whole program ready. We had the speakers ready. The invitations were about to be sent out. I think it was March, something early March. And guess what? Just before the invitations went out, COVID. And that was the end of the story. And by that time it was over. Belgium was no longer the president of the Security Council, and it didn't happen. And these are things that are unfortunate, because you miss a huge opportunity. And we had some other meetings and so on, but that one, if it had happened back then in March 2020, it would have been very different. Our whole work following that. So,
wow. Yeah. Before we started recording, we were talking about how it's interesting the ways in which this kind of conversation has mostly disappeared from international conversations. There is so much more focus on geopolitical risk, and now there's much more war than there has been in recent years. And it's kind of felt this way since the pandemic. In my experience, coming from like the climate tech world, there was still like a venture capital boom that went through about 2022, but then has since fizzled out. I find myself observing geopolitical events. We were talking about the war in Iran just a little bit ago, and yes, there's like lots of emissions even coming from this, but now there are huge impacts on oil and gas production that's going to have lasting effects for many, many years. And and all the while, I find myself like, when I'm spending time with friends who are not, do not work in climate change stuff and aren't necessarily paying attention to this, I feel a little like a little Cassandra-y. Or Chicken Little. It's like, I don't know that you guys understand the current state of things. And you mentioned the way that you were having conversations back in 2016 and 17, and that was an entirely different world back then. And I remember in the early days of carbon removal, of trying to make the case that like, yeah, this actually has to happen. Just even convincing people that would be necessary was the first task. Whereas now it's like very obvious and is totally an accepted international policy goal. Where has the conversation gone, and why is it that at a time when things are actually like legitimately scary and we face some severe existential risks, warming has accelerated, why isn't this something that is being discussed?
It's a very good question, and there are quite a few reasons for that. But I would start with the sort of one of the top ones is that the global diplomatic community is totally busy with the wars and the humanitarian challenges and the military challenges and all of that comes with it. The bandwidth is simply not big enough to deal with all these issues. It's very simple. And if you look back in the past, there were many other situations where there were big things that happen, and then the diplomats just simply don't have enough time to actually deal with important issues, whether it's climate related or something else. So that to me is number one. But even if we sort of put that aside, I think there is another important element here is that politicians dislike to talk about issues publicly when they don't see the solution, and when it's different than what they've been saying for many, many years before that. And let me be a bit more specific here. So the global climate diplomatic community has been focusing on 1.5C, reaching 1.5C. We have to do everything, keep it alive, make sure we don't go beyond. And of course, I agree with that. I think it's very important to have such a goal. if for nothing else, when we go above it, then we know where to come back at some stage. But the whole diplomatic discourse is so much focused on this that it's very difficult then for the politicians to say, well, actually, there is something else here which is related, but it's different, and we have to deal with that. And so they are unwilling, they're afraid. I actually wrote couple of years ago an article that was picked up in the Le Monde that it's why politicians are afraid to talk about these other issues, and so we have that challenge, and we have to find ways to help them beyond that, which means bringing to them the solutions, the solution spaces that they can then say, oh well, but there are ways. There's this, there is that, and then there is something else. This is easy, this is difficult, and this is very difficult, but we have to choose which one we're going to make happen.
Now that gets to a couple of different patterns I've observed in this climate interventions community. One is, Laurie Laybourne at the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative in the UK has advocated for his descriptive term derailment risk of if we have large scale tipping points happening, or as just even not just tipping points, but even linear progression of impacts from climate change, that this speaks to what you were just speaking about. There's only so much bandwidth that policy makers, politicians, diplomats can handle at any one time, and they have to focus on the most immediate pressing needs, and which are often the second or third order effects of climate related things. So that is an argument for the second pattern, which is a sense of urgency. And I speak to people who believe that, we have a narrow window of time from right here. We are in March of 2026 at the moment. And there is some speculation around we only have a couple of years at most to really advance these conversations so that we can get it through and have these, go through the process of developing this governance before we start further degrading our capacity to ever get that in the first place. Do you agree with that perspective?
Well, I certainly agree with the perspective that the climate situation is much more serious and dire than what our politicians are prepared to present to the publics. This is, when when you look at the current significant and often catastrophic impacts of climate change, and I'm looking at the world, whether it's a third of Pakistan being flooded, or whether it's forests in Los Angeles suburbs burning, all of this. Some of this is really, really serious, and there is a lot more to come, a lot more, because the temperatures are going up, because the emissions are still not coming down the way they should be. And so I agree with it. I think it's serious, and I think it's urgent that we address this issue and come to some kind of society-wide acceptance of either going ahead, deciding to go ahead with cooling the planet, or deciding not to go ahead cooling the planet. And then we'll have to figure out what else we're going to do. But we need to deal with this, and we can't just put it under the carpet. And what I find often is that when I talk about these issues, I say, oh no, but we're for emission reductions. Of course, I'm for emission reductions as well. That is the number one priority, because the more emission we reduce now, the less potentially solar cooling, solar radiation modification we have to do in the future, either less intensively or for a shorter period of time. So, of course, we need to do that. It's in addition, it's not instead of. And anyway, it's a challenge. And I think one important missing element is to get on board people who are well-known, politicians or others, who are able to convert this scientific slash policy complicated subject into narratives that people understand, and then maybe we will be able to have a better way to move forward on this.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. That's a lot of what I've been trying to advocate for as well. And actually, maybe that's a good segue to what prompted this conversation. I wrote an article about my observation that from an outside perspective of countries not really being ready yet for having this discussion at the higher level that we're talking about here, because there is a progression, like a sequencing of understanding and awareness and like capability development within a country's like scientific community, within policy spheres, and so on. And I was commenting that it seems like where there is some progress being made within some countries is in this risk first framing of discussing, especially in the Nordics, who are looking at AMOC collapse risk, the UK and their national emergency briefing and that kind of thing. You emailed me after and you pushed back a little gently, saying, the reality is it's much more complicated than that, and there are NGOs and academia and private sector, and they all need to move through different stages in parallel. So what does that look like in practice?
Yeah, so it's first of all that if you think of a government, the government's position will come from a very complicated set of activities, institutions in the country that have their own process of understanding what the issue are and then coming to a conclusion that we need to do something about it. So they get this input from many different places, and you have a minister and you have senior advisors of a minister, and even if, let's say, the senior advisor is totally convinced about your initial stage, to fully understand what the issues are and what the impacts will be, that does not immediately translate into a policy statement by the government. And even if there is some movement, then they will have to see what the different actors in the political part of the country how they will react. So there are these feedbacks from them. And they expect the feedback, because policy is never simply made on a simple, logical, scientific, evidence-based approach. It is hopefully an important part of the inputs, but the inputs come from all these other political processes. So there's multiple levels of feedback before it becomes something where you say, okay, now we're going to do something about it. Now, you mentioned the Nordics, and especially, I think Iceland was very interesting in terms of recognizing that any change in the North Atlantic circulations, the kind of changes that are being presented by science, could have tremendous impacts on those countries. And so it's become a security risk. And they've established that. And then it's the Nordics sort of engaged as well. These are group of countries that have perhaps a certain record of looking forward a bit more than some other countries. But at the end of the day, we all need to do that, because if you just take the North Atlantic circulation, it's not just that Northern Europe will get colder, but some other place will get much warmer because the heat is not being taken away. And so suddenly the whole world is different, and we have to be ready for that. So
and there are follow-on effects too. Like if you can't grow food the same way in Europe anymore, like that impacts global food supplies, and even in rich Western countries, they would be impacted.
So what I meant in my reaction is that, yes, there is even governments and people in government, the individuals, they have their different stages. Yes, I think that makes sense, what the way you described it. But those three stages get impacted by different inputs, political, scientific, religious, you name it. And, religious, this is many people feel that cooling the planet is something that we shouldn't do. We shouldn't play God. Now, this is serious for people who think that way, and we need to deal with it. So it's not just simply risk versus risk in a numerical way, but we have to look at the risks and the benefits and the challenges, some which are not quantifiable and still very, very important.
Yeah. There's this sense of like, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is like this coalition building is important in coalition building across the different ways that people think, across different value systems that people hold, so that when we do get to a point of if we do end up doing this, that there is this collective buy-in of the accepting the outcomes as well. And so if things don't go the way that we expect them to, then we still have the support of civil society, and so that you can continue to progress through it. And something we haven't talked about yet here is the role of the Global South in this. And so, thinking back to your time with C2G or anything since then, is there any sort of the Global South gets brought up a lot in discussions of SRM. Developed Western countries have essentially caused this problem through their development. Countries that are still developing are stuck in this position of like wanting to reach that and improve living conditions, but how do you do it in a way that doesn't make climate change worse? And they're like geographically located in places that are going to be much more impacted more soon than Western countries. So it's they play a critical role, but what is that role in your mind, and what has your experience been with them?
Yeah. So it's a reality that most of the science, most of the research on the issues related to planetary cooling, stratospheric aerosol injection, they come from northern researchers in universities, think tanks, whatever. That is a fact. But that fact is changing, and what we found early on is that there was willingness to talk about these issues, generally speaking. Again, not everywhere, but it was. If anything, we found that there was more openness in the Global South to talk about it, to try to address these issues than, for example, in Northern Europe. That was our experience. So, and since that time, thanks to fantastic work by groups like the Degrees Initiative, there has been a very interesting development of research by scientists from the Global South looking at impacts of SRM in the Global South, and that's super interesting. And they're not just because they're finding out interesting ideas of how this could work and what will be the positive, negative impacts and so on, but they're building a group of scientists who are able to build on the science and actually start talking to their decision makers about these issues. And that's very different. How many times did that happen to me when I was visiting different countries, and I remember the one which was the most straight one like this was in Pakistan, and the minister, when I briefed her, she looked at her assistant, said sitting next to her, said, "Okay, what do the Pakistani scientists say about this?" That was her first thing. She was not saying, "What does the IPCC say about this?" She says, "What does Pakistani scientists?" And then luckily that one could bring it in because there were some Pakistani scientists working on this. So the connection was made, and then the conversation continued. So this is very interesting because it creates this capacity in the Global South to address these issues. And there was a case of the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment that came with a decision to promote the non-use of this technology. And at the same time, a bunch of African scientists wrote an op-ed saying that this is really important to understand how this works and what are the impacts and what we can do about it. So, we'll see how that has an impact on the position of countries and eventually intra-African discussions and negotiations on this issue.
That's really interesting that your experience in Pakistan. I mean, that's exactly how I've heard degrees described, is that they need to make sure that there is this local capacity for that. Something else that people talk about is in the context of, like, for instance, the Overshoot Commission, their sort of approach to trying to move the ball forward on this is trying to put together a multilateral group of countries, maybe say 6 countries or so, who are in the same way that you were describing Belgium trying to take a leadership role in the UN, like calling for that. And from the perspective of the people that are working on this, I think that they would advocate that there really need to be representation from countries in the global south in such a commission, or in such a group of countries. Who do you think is perhaps best positioned? Like, who are there countries specifically in the global south that you think are interested in taking a leadership role in how we continue this conversation?
So I am not sure if I can answer this well now, because, as you know, we terminated the C2G activities at the end of 2023. So since that time, I'm still following the issues. I talk to people and so on, but it's not the same as being really plugged into that. But having said this, I think that some countries stand out because of the work that has been done, often by scientists, groups of scientists, and therefore creating the kind of capacity that one needs to be able to deal with this issue. And they certainly include South Africa, Ghana, India, China. India a bit less so, but lately things have been picking up in India quite a bit. So these are countries where capacity is there. Also, Brazil is interesting. There are quite a few people who have been working on these issues. There have been some meetings. There was actually a meeting organized by the Ministry of Science and Technology together with one of the key NGOs in Brazil on this topic before COP30. I was one of the speakers online, but so there are these countries that have capacity. Whether they are ready to to provide some kind of leadership for a group, I don't know. I don't know that maybe others who are now currently working with these different countries may be able to address that better.
When you were doing your work with C2G, were there any approaches taken for these conversations that perhaps seemed to backfire or just didn't work? And what did you learn from those?
It's interesting because I don't think there was anything where things backfired, something like that. No, I think we learned things. Not everything worked perfectly. And I think one thing that was very clear to us when in 2019, the Swiss government and 8 or 9 other countries, I forget now, presented a draft resolution to the UN Environment Assembly. And we were very much involved in even preparing that together with the Swiss. And then we traveled and we tried to proactively sell the resolution in different countries. And we came to a conclusion that was not right from our perspective as per our mission objectives. We went a little bit too far, and
Okay.
So we from after that, we stepped back from that kind of active support, because at the end of the day, our purpose was not to actually have that resolution accepted. We would have liked it to be accepted, but the main purpose from our perspective was that to have governments start talking about this issue and actually put it on the agenda. And they did. It was the resolution didn't succeed, but the conversation took place, and that's very important. So it was something we learned, and something we then practiced in a very different way. But uh, generally things worked well. There was the number one challenge was that they trust us, that they should trust us in what we're bringing to them. And I must say that having been UN Assistant Secretary on climate change before that, that sort of thing helped, because I worked with many of these people, and some of my colleagues in C2G were in the same office, in the office of the Secretary General. So we were known commodity in many of these contexts, and that helped. But it didn't last for a long time, and we had to cultivate that. To make sure that the trust remained, and impartiality, as I mentioned at the beginning, was absolutely key for this, and we really worked on that. And you can't imagine how careful we were about anything we actually wrote and drafted, to make sure that it doesn't look like we're too pro or too anti, that it is really impartial, which of course got us into trouble with many, because for many people, if you're not with them, you're against them, right? And so we had that, but it's okay. I think we did okay, and in terms of the uh, uh, in terms of the continued trust in us. It was also part of this strategy for us to identify leaders or senior leaders who would be positive enough to what we were trying to do, that they would either do something publicly or allow further conversation. So I give you one concrete example. There was a period when Pakistan was chairing the Group of 77 in China, that is the group of developing countries in the United Nations. It's 137 countries, not 77. But anyway, it's still called G77. And the Pakistani ambassador in New York was very open to this discussion. He not in the sense of being positive about using SRM, but to open up the discussion. And it was very helpful, because then with his help, we managed to get eventually the next president of the G77, the chair, which was Cuba, and they then organized a briefing of the entire G77 and China in New York in the United Nations, and we briefed them, and there was a fantastic discussion. So, once you get the right person who can help to open the door, then you can walk through that door, and then you have to do what you have to do, right? So
you were describing the role of C2G was this like impartiality. What do you think? And that was a different era. And so here in 2026, what do you think is needed for? Where are the gaps in this field right now that you think need to be filled?
Well, I think that the biggest gap right now is what we already talked about, but let me put it in a different way. So right now, what we have a number of activities of for-profit or non-profit entities that are doing R&D, that are dealing with these issues, but there is nothing actually happening. Let me rephrase that governments have not been addressing the governance needs that are arising. So what we have some non-governmental entities bottom up working on this, and that's great, because not all governance needs to come from governments, especially on the research governance. I think that's a very good example where non-governmental entities can do very good stuff by simply coordinating with each other, setting up voluntary approaches and so on, and it can work very well. And eventually, when the governments get ready, it can be brought into some kind of more formal structure if there is such a possibility. But there's nothing stopping. There is the group, the DSG, that is working on this with a bunch of other entities, other non-governmental organizations, and I think that's great. And that's very, very helpful. But what we need is really much more societal conversations about this issue. I think this is crucial to improve understanding of people of what this is and what it isn't, and why. I mean, one of the things we also learned in C2G uh, is that if you just simply talk about this as a technology issue, you'll get nowhere. Uh, this is not about SRM technology or SAI technology. The problem is that it's getting hot. And what are we going to do about that as societies? And that's the challenge. And that is something that people understand. Yeah, it's getting hot. I understand that today, as we speak in Arizona, the temperatures are uh, way beyond what they should be. And people feel it. So they say, okay, well, what can we do about this? And then you can have a conversation that, look, it's going to get warmer. It's going to get warmer in the next years and decades, almost whatever we do. And these are the three things we can do about it. We can increase adaptation efforts. We can start some local cooling methods, and we may have to think about some global cooling methods. Now, how do we deal with that? What are the challenges? We need to discuss them. And this is, to me, the biggest gap, is conversations at various levels involving various stakeholders in society about these issues.
We've talked about this like unilateral versus multilateral kind of approach, but and maybe this is part of that, but like what worries you the most? Are you more concerned about like under preparing for this, or or something else? Like what do you fear might happen?
Yeah. So I think that maybe the first thing that I fear is what's happening in the world today. The geopolitical challenges, the wars in Sudan, in Ukraine, Middle East, and not only these have direct environmental impacts, emission impacts that are huge, uh, but as we said earlier, they take away they reduce the bandwidth of what diplomats can do about other issues than the war. So, but also it's not just about the wars, because there is a bigger challenge that we face in terms of the multilateral approach. There is a tendency by countries say, okay, it's my country first, and we do it, and we don't care too much about the others. And it's not just what's happening in the United States. Let's be honest. This is a trend that is there, and this is a time where maybe instead of trying to focus on the ideal governance solutions for planetary cooling, whether or local cooling, let's focus on the more local, more regional, bottom-up type governance solutions, hopefully, which can then eventually be linked into multilateral approaches when the time is right. But that really worries me, that how to move forward on this. The other is that, which again we discussed earlier, is the timing. I mean, we don't have much time. The situation is really dire. And the question that arises, which I think is really important, is that if ever one contemplates cooling, do you want to wait 20, 30 years and see the people dying and see the sea level rising and all that, and then say, okay, let's do it? Or do you want to avoid all that, which means we need to do it quickly? And that's a discussion, again, which needs to be had. And there will be views on it. There will be different views on it, and so on. So I think those are some of the things that keep me awake. And then I am worried about unilateral action. We talked about it, but it is something that if it really happens in the way that unilateral, one country decides we're going to do it and they don't care about the rest of the world and just go ahead and do it, that could be very, very, very challenging. Beyond the normal risks of this new technology, but simply the risks of the unilateral approach. So that is something happening, and I hope we avoid that.
What do you think about the risks of potential great power conflict from from SRM, especially if there were a unilateral deployment?
That's a difficult one because the great power conflicts of the 21st century are just formulating themselves today as we look out the window, and it's not clear to me what is the actual expected evolution of the relationship between the United States and Russia and China. To just mention the three big ones there, it can go many different ways. And the impact on discussing or dealing with this global issue of potential planetary cooling will be very, very different depending on how these relationships evolve. Um, you know, it's not a secret that Russia is not unhappy with the melting of the Arctic ice because of easier access to fossil fuels. So the more we can do to transition away from those fossil fuels, the better it is. But China is very interested in the northern passage for ships because they'll be able to get their export products to markets much faster and much cheaper. So it is not an automatic thing that you and I agree that it's too warm. Okay, we agree, but maybe others don't. And maybe there needs to be some negotiation. And maybe there are ways to address that, collectively. So I don't look at this as hopeless, but I do look at it as a challenge that needs to be addressed. And it's very hard to do it at a time when wars are taking place and it's not clear which side is helping whom and so on and so forth. Very difficult time. So let's hope that the wars finish early so we can then focus on these other issues.
Yeah. What do you think? And maybe this is getting close to wrapping up here. What do you think are the ways to collectively address that? Like if you were active in your C2G role today, what would you be doing, and would it be any different than what you've done previously?
Well, I no, and that's why we stopped C2G, because we felt that more of the same is not what's needed. Now,
Okay.
what we need is something different. And what's interesting is we see different groups popping up, and they're doing different things, and that's good. We need groups that are clearly able to make the case, hopefully not just the ideological case, but the evidence-based case against the use of solar radiation modification, and equally make the evidence-based case for the use of solar radiation modification, and then provide that basis to international discussions and so on, so that eventually we can get ready to what I mentioned early on, that we need to be on some kind of a path that results in a decision-making event process at some point. And and that's what is needed. If you only have people against, or if you only have people for, then you can't drive a serious societal conversation. And so I think it's good to see that there are these entities happening. It's good to see that we have sometimes for-profit, sometimes non-profit. That's a big discussion again, whether how for-profit should come into this at all, if at all. But what is important is that there are activities, and they're kind of pushing the discussion that should they exist when society doesn't have a social license for this. Okay, well, either we need to ban them, or we need to develop some kind of social license so they can operate and do R&D. So this is the kind of thing that society needs to do, and we need to do it quickly, so that the activities that are taking place can be done within a framework, or that they're banned, and then there's no question. Then we stop them, and then we just have to see what we're going to do if we don't have that, because the problem is still there. It's going to get warm. It's going to get a lot warmer in the coming decades.
I think that's a good place to wrap up. Thank you very much for coming on, Janos. This is really informative, and I look forward to continuing many more conversations with you in the future.
And thank you very much, Paul. I've enjoyed our discussion, and I hope it's helpful to move the debate forward. Thanks.
I hope so too. Thank you.